Last time we spoke about the fall of Shuri. In the unforgiving terrain of Okinawa during May of 1945, American Marines confronted fierce resistance from entrenched Japanese forces. Amidst heavy rain and dwindling supplies, General Buckner's 10th Army battled uphill towards Shuri, a critical stronghold. With communications crumbling and morale wavering, the Americans pressed on, launching daring patrols. The situation reached a turning point when intelligence revealed that the Japanese were withdrawing. Buckner ordered continuous pressure, leading to the capture of significant strategic points like Shuri Castle, which was relentlessly bombarded prior to the Marine assault. On May the 29th, as the last remnants of the Japanese forces fled south, American troops swept through Shuri, which lay in utter ruins, a testament to the devastating power of the campaign. This episode is The Liberation of Mindanao. Welcome back to the Pacific War podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and can help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of those, I released an episode covering Japan's government by assassination period. And hey, if you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 25 episodes and ongoing, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. So last week we covered the fall of Shuri, and today we're going to continue the brutal brawl for Okinawa and the liberation of Mindanao. As we last saw, the Japanese retreat from the Shuri line opened the path for General Buckner's 10th Army to move southward, with only General Fujioka's 62nd Division and a few minor rearguards standing in their way. On June the 3rd, General Arnold's 7th Division continued their offensive to the south. Colonel Patchler's 17th Regiment successfully secured the area of Itokazu. Meanwhile, Colonel Green's 184th Regiment pushed towards the coast, completely cutting off the Chinan Peninsula. Colonel Finn's 32nd Regiment was diverted into the rugged hills nearby to clean up remaining resistance. Over to the west, despite persistent bad weather and challenging supply conditions, General Bradley's 96th Division also achieved some success. Colonel May's 383rd Regiment secured the locations of Kimazato and Tera against relatively light resistance. At the same time, Colonel Halloran's 381st Regiment advanced to seize the entire Inosome area. To the northwest, General Duval's 1st Marine Division encountered some very strong opposition. The bulk of the 5th Marines managed to push only as far as Tsukasa before being pinned down. In a strategic move, Colonel Griebel's 2nd Battalion executed a wide swing through May's rear area to capture the Gisushi region. Colonel Snedeker's 7th Marines made some steady progress through the Kokoba Valley, facing small enemy blocking forces, in order to extend the line held by the 5th Marines. Meanwhile, at sea, Admiral Gaka launched his 9th Mass Kekusai attack. This operation featured just 50 kamikaze aircraft. They faced heavy obstacles due to Typhoon Viper, but still managed to damage about 2 vessels. In another development, after successfully occupying Torishima Island on May the 12th, Colonel Clarence Wallace's 8th Marines landed on Iajima without encountering any opposition. In addition, preparations for the shore-to-shore assault of General Shepard's 6th Marine Division were completed. Colonel Shapley's 4th Marines were set on land on Nishikoku beaches before securing the Oroku Peninsula and its airfield. Consequently, during the early hours of June the 4th, Shepard's reconnaissance company successfully assaulted Onoyama Island, while Shapley's assault battalions began the shore-to-shore movement to Nishikoku under the cover of artillery naval bombardment. Despite some mechanical failures on the LVTs, the Marines successfully landed at 6 a.m. under sporadic machine gun fire, and they pushed on to some high ground 300 yards inland against just minor resistance. After securing the initial foothold, the attack slowed against increasing resistance on the left flank. Because of this, the reserve 3rd Battalion was landed at 8:45 a.m. and subsequently advanced to the edge of the airdrome. By the way, I think I have to say this here. I am sorry for the sound of my voice. I have strep. I haven't been able to record for days, and it's simply packing up, so bear with me, please. During the day development of the enemy's defenses, they had revealed an inordinate number of automatic weapons, ranging in various calibers up to 40 millimeters. Subsequently, it was disclosed that the Japanese had stripped the armament from the air defenses and damaged aircraft in the area, and integrated these weapons into ground fortifications to stiffen materially the resistance of Oroku. Besides meeting with the most extensive minefields yet encountered during the campaign, on this day the 6th Division had its first contact with an awesome weapon, an 8-inch rocket that exploded with terrific concussion. However, there was little fragmentation and accuracy. While the noise the huge projectiles made tumbling through the air, end over end, sounded like a locomotive from hell, to the troops that is, the rockets were mainly a source of annoyance and caused very few casualties. Rockets continued to fall in the rear areas during the night. Snipers and infiltrators were active, and the entire front came under intermittent heavy motor fire. This landing allowed Shepard to bring in Colonel Whaling's 29th Marines by midday, which then secured the Kikibana area of Naha Bay, while the 4th Marines captured 1/3 of Naha's airfield. Further to the east, the Americans encountered less resistance than before, as the 62nd Division and other minor rearguards completed their withdrawal from the intermediate lines south of Shuri to a reserve area south of the new Kiyamu Peninsula lines. Recognizing this change, Buckner shifted the corps boundary to the west, assigning General Geiger's 3rd Amphibious Corps with the task of isolating the Oroku Peninsula and occupying the Itoman-Kunishi sector, while General Hodge's 24th Corps advanced towards the Yajudake-Yuzedake escarpment. As a result, the 7th Marines were able to move south to seize Takunyuta and isolate Admiral Ota's forces on the Oroku Peninsula. The atrocious weather had converted the already muddy roads to impassable morass. Transport was hopelessly mired north of the Kokobagawa. South of the river, the trails, quote, were only negotiable by foot troops. Vehicles could not have been used, even if it had been possible to bring them across the inlet. The 5th Marines managed to secure Hill 107 without opposition before being relieved by Colonel Mason's 1st Marines. However, the 1st Marines were unable to continue their push south towards Shindawaku Ridge due to the flooded stream. Meanwhile, Mason's 3rd Battalion attempted a wide envelopment through the 96th Divisional Zone, but they were quickly halted in front of the Terra. Food was growing scarce, but through the wholehearted cooperation of the 96th Division, the Marines procured 2 meals of K-rations per man. It was the considered opinion of at least one member of the 3rd Battalion that, quote, this day probably was the most miserable spent in Okinawa by the men of this battalion. To compound these problems and discomforts, the 3rd Battalion also found itself without a supply route or communications with the regiment over 11,000 yards to the rear. Further to the east, the 383rd Regiment advanced rapidly, engaging isolated but strong enemy delaying groups as they secured the outskirts of Iwa. Matching this progress, the 381st Regiment advanced all the way to the hills north of Arigusuku, facing steadily increasing resistance. Additionally, while the 17th Regiment established positions controlling the Minatoga-Mika Road, the 184th Regiment advanced against patchy and ineffective resistance until the Minatoga area was secured. The following morning, Admiral McCain's Task Force 38 launched strikes on Okinawa and Kyushu. Unfortunately, poor situational awareness from Admiral Halsey caused the 3rd Fleet to inadvertently enter Typhoon Viper. This giant storm inflicted varying degrees of damage to 4 carriers, 2 escort carriers, 3 cruisers, 1 destroyer, and 1 tanker, while also destroying 76 planes. Additionally, kamikaze attacks succeeded in damaging the battleship Mississippi and the heavy cruiser Louisville. Back over in Okinawa, Shepard's attack on the Oroku Peninsula commenced and progressed slowly but steadily against uniformly stubborn resistance. The 4th Marines secured most of the airfield and the Toma high ground, while the 29th Marines fought laboriously to advance towards Mura and Oroku, gaining up to 1,000 yards. To their east, the 7th Marines advanced to positions just north of Hanja, while the 1st Marines bypassed the inundated area in front of them by swinging east and following their 3rd Battalion towards Iwa. In fact, Mason's 3rd Battalion launched another attack aimed at Shindawaku Ridge, advancing over 3,000 yards to the area west of Iwa. Despite muddy conditions and rain weather, Hodge's infantrymen continued to penetrate the enemy outpost zone, developing the edges of the main Japanese battle position. The outpost line of Kiyamu Peninsula was fully manned on June the 4th. Japanese Army headquarters estimated that the strength of its now concentrated forces totaled 30,000, distributed as follows: 24th Division and attached units, about 12,000 men; The 67th Division attached units were about 7,000 men. The 44th Independent Mixed Brigade and attached units were 3,000 men. The 5th Artillery Command and its attached units were about 3,000, and units directly under the 32nd Army Command equaled about 5,000. The difference in total strength between the 50,000-man estimate late in May and the 30,000 left in the Okinawa Peninsula was attributed to, quote, attrition during retirement operations. Only about 20% of the remaining troops were survivors of the original crack infantry artillery units. The rest were untrained rear echelon personnel, or boitai. Most senior commanders at battalion levels and above were still alive, however, and capable of bolstering the fighting spirit of their motley collection of men. But the 32nd Army had suffered grievous losses in weapons and equipment since L-Day. Hand grenades and explosives were almost entirely expended. 4 out of 5 machine guns had been destroyed, and the supply of heavy infantry cannons and mortars had been reduced to nearly vanishing points. Despite the fact that 2 150mm guns, 16 150mm howitzers, and 10 anti-aircraft guns had been successfully withdrawn to the Okinawa Peninsula, artillery ammunition levels were insufficient for more than 10 days of sustained firing. General Ushijima's 32nd Army was in desperate straits, its destruction merely a question of time. But the tradition, discipline, and the indoctrination of the Japanese military forces promised only a violent, last-ditch, man-to-man struggle before the Battle of Okinawa was ended. By June the 6th, the 7th Division reached the outskirts of Gushichan, and the 96th Division advanced towards Shindawaku and Tomai. Over to the west, the 1st Marines finally captured Shindawaku, and they cleared the bypassed area behind them. Meanwhile, the 7th Marines attacked towards Hill 108, advancing 1,000 yards before encountering stiff resistance and ultimately digging around Dakitom. Additionally, Colonel Roberts' 22nd Marines arrived to contain the Oroku Peninsula in the Hill 103 sector. Although the 29th Marines and Shapley's 1st Battalion made very little progress in the Orokumura area due to strong enemy resistance. Meanwhile, the terrain confronted by the 3rd Battalion was, quote, consisted of a series of small temple-like hills, each of which had been converted into a fortress, from which mutually supporting automatic weapons could cover adjacent positions and deny the open ground between the hills. These gun positions were well dug in and impervious to artillery fire. Because of the narrow roads in the area that had been made impassable by mines and shell catering, tank support was not forthcoming, and a day of bitter fighting netted a gain of just scant 150 yards. The remainder of the 4th Marines attacked Naha airfield, where counterfire from tanks, artillery, and support craft were immediately laid down. An urgent call for an airstrike on the island was answered in less than half an hour, as, quote, as rack after rack of bombs fell in the nip positions, the troops stood up and cheered. The artillery piece was soon silenced, but 20mm fire was received spasmodically. Nevertheless, they pressed forward with their open flank covered by continuous airstrikes on Sanagashima and completed the capture of Naha airfield before noon, whence they pushed towards Gushi. At sea, kamikaze attacks crashed into and damaged 2 destroyer minesweepers, while also causing further damage to the escort carrier Natoma Bay and the destroyer Anthony on June the 7th. That day, Shepard's Marines faced stiff resistance all along the front. The 4th Marines reduced Little Sugar Loaf Hill, where stiff resistance and bitter fighting characterized the action in the center and on the left of the 4th Marines area. However, the attack forged ahead against machine gun fire, quote, coming from everywhere, while countless caves were methodically cleaned out and sealed by old processes of direct fire, flame, and demolitions. Meanwhile, the 29th Marines entered Oroku, and the 22nd Marines captured Hill 103 and the area south of Tamagusuki. To the southeast, the 7th Marines overran Hanja and Hill 108, ultimately digging in just north of Zawa and linking up with the 1st Marines, which also advanced up to 1,200 yards as they secured Hill 75 and pushed towards Yuza. Further east, the primary offensive efforts of the 7th and 96th Divisions on June the 7th and 8th were focused on probing enemy defenses and advancing assault battalions to more favorable positions for an attack. Additionally, by the afternoon of June the 8th, the 32nd Regiment successfully relieved the exhausted 184th. In the Gushichan area. On that same day, the 1st Marines pressed forward to the high ground overlooking the Mukai River, while the 7th Marines moved through Zawa and began probing enemy positions in Itoman, encountering stiff resistance. The 1st LVT, supported by LVTAs, arrived at the newly uncovered beaches at noon on June the 8th, and shortly thereafter, General Hodge sent General Deval, congratulations for cutting the island in 2. Meanwhile, in Oroku, the 29th Marines made little progress as they stalled at the key ridgeline on the left. The 4th Marines committed all 3 of their battalions for the attack, successfully securing the areas of Hill 39 and Gushi Ridge. The 22nd Marines continued to pivot on their right, seizing Hill 55 and making good progress along the front towards Chiwa and Tomigusuki. On June the 9th, although the 22nd Marines managed to secure Hill 55 and they pushed on to Hill 28, little advancement was achieved to the north. Concurrently, the 4th Marines were able to slowly push to the outskirts of Chiwa and Uribaru, with patrols clearing out Chiwa and Whaling Surbiton extending the front to the north. The action in the zone of the 4th Marines on June the 9th remained unchanged from the preceding days. The advance was still slow and tedious against bitter resistance. Every Jap seemed to be armed with a machine gun, and there was still the same light and heavy motor fire. Casualties continued to mount, and the number of Japs killed soared over the maximum of 1,500, which were supposed to be defending that area. There were still plenty left. In the meantime, to the south, Deval sent strong patrols across Muke, which began to encounter stiff enemy resistance. Consequently, the 7th Marines were able to push towards Tara and Itoman. Further east, Hodge finally launched a corps attack to the south. The 96th Division focused its efforts on softening up the enemy positions on the escarpment in front of them, while the 7th Division carried out the offensive. The 32nd Regiment attempted to attack the eastern end of Hill 95, but they were unsuccessful. However, they did manage to locate and identify the most troublesome sources of enemy fire for destruction. On a more positive note, the 17th Regiment gained a precarious foothold on the southern end of the Yajudake, just north of Nakaza, where they would withstand several Japanese counterattacks throughout the night. The first and the greatest obstacle confronting Wallace's attack was the open ground over which both the assault companies had to move. Wallace used all available support, and the men camouflaged themselves with grass and rice plants, but enemy fire began almost as soon as the leading platoons moved into the open. The infantrymen crawled through the slimy rice paddies on their stomachs. Within an hour, Company I was strung from the line of departure to the base of the objective with 2 squads that had just reached it. At about this time, the Japanese opened fire with another machine gun, separating the advanced squads with a band of fire. This left 1 squad to continue the attack. The remainder of the company was unable to move, cut off by the fire, or strung across the rice paddies. Those men in the squad, still free to operate, lifted and pulled each other to the edge of the cliff and crawled quietly forward through the high grass on the top. Private First Class Ignek Zelensky, a barman, moved so stealthily that he almost touched the heels of one Japanese guy. Zelensky killed him, and the other men killed 8 more Japanese within the first 10 minutes. Another squad reached the top of the escarpment about an hour later, but was caught in the cross and grazing fire from the 3 machine guns, and the entire 8-man squad was killed. Gradually, however, a few more men reached the top, and by the evening there was 20 men from Company I holding a small area at the escarpment rim. Company K had a similar experience. Accurate enemy fire killed 1 man, wounded 2 others, and halted the company when it was from 200 to 300 yards from its objective. For 45 minutes, the attack dragged on until Sergeant Lester Johnson and 8 men maneuvered forward through enemy fire, gained the high ground, and concentrated their fire on the enemy machine gun that was firing on the remainder of their company. They did not silence the gun, but did prevent the gunner from aiming well, and Johnson waited for the rest of the company to follow. By 1:30 p.m. on June the 9th, Company K was consolidated on the southeastern tip of the Yajudake. That evening, 3 small but determined counterattacks with sustained grenade fire between each attempt hit the small force from Company I, which held off the attackers with light machine gun and automatic rifles. Additionally, Wallace's 1st Battalion successfully landed unopposed on Oguni Island to establish air warning and fighter directive installations. However, it's now time to leave Okinawa, as we're going to shift our focus back over to the Philippines to cover the continuation of General Eichelberger's Mindanao campaign. As we had last saw, back on May the 3rd, General Silver's 10th Corps had successfully invaded the island and secured the key Kabakan Road Junction. General Woodruff's 24th Division occupied Digos and Davao, while General Martin's 31st Division advanced up the Sarare Highway towards Kibawe. Thanks to the arrival of the 162nd Regiment from Zamboanga, the 31st Division was now able to send another regiment, the 155th, to assist the push north against General Morozumi's 30th Division. In response to the rapid advance of the 31st Division, as far as Kibawe, Morozumi was assembling his units at Malibale in preparation for a retreat eastwards to the Agusan Valley. He dispatched the 3rd Battalion of the 74th Regiment to the south to delay the Americans in the vicinity of Maramag, at least until May the 10th. Meanwhile, after capturing Davao, Woodruff's goal was to mop up the sector and destroy General Harada's 100th Division in the mountainous interior. The 100th Division was located in the southern anchor of its defenses at Katigan, 13 miles southwest of Davao, and the northern anchor in the hills some 12 miles north of Davao. The Davao River, flowing generally south to southeast into Davao Gulf at Davao, divided the defensive forces into two groupments. The right sector unit, west of the river, was composed of 5 infantry battalions, 3 regular and 2 provincial. The territory east of the river was the responsibility of the left sector unit, 2 regular infantry battalions and 2 provincial battalions, and the Air Force's Hosono unit of the ill-armed service personnel. The right and left sector units had little artillery attached to them, for General Harada kept under his direct control most of his artillery, as well as many engineer and service units. As a reserve, Harada had about a battalion of regular infantry. The central and strongest portion of Harada's defenses rested on its right, on the rising ground overlooking Liberation, 2 miles northwest of Talomo, over on the coast. From this vantage point, the central defenses, along with Harada, initially deployed 3 battalions extending eastward towards Talomo River and through some rough hills to the west bank of the Davao River. The focal point of the central defenses was Mintal, about 4 miles up Route 1D from Talomo. Anticipating ultimate withdrawal into the mountainous via Route 1D, the southeastern section of the so-called Kebawe-Talomo Trail, Harada had prepared defenses in depth along the highway and along the ancillary roads paralleling it. Much of the region west of the Davao River from Talomo, northwest 12 miles to Kalinan, was covered with overgrown abacia, or hemp, plantations. Resembling banana plants and growing to a height of about 20 feet, the abacia plants had originally been planted in rows 10 feet apart, with 10 feet between the plants. With harvesting slack during the war, the plantations had become quite thick with the shoots, and the older plants had grown about a foot or so in diameter. Plants of various sizes were in April of 1945 scarcely a foot apart. Visibility was virtually nil, and the heat of the hemp plantations was like that of an oven. With the 162nd Regiment taking control of Digos and the area stretching from Ilana Bay's shores inland to Kabakan, Woodruff was now free to utilize his entire division to engage the enemy forces in the Davao area. At the start of May, the 21st Regiment had already launched an attack to clear Liberation, Route 1D between Mintal and Talomo, and Mintal itself. They successfully reached Mintal by May the 3rd, effectively forcing Harada to reinforce his defenses near the Talomo River. Although the aerodrome was cleared out about 2 days later, subsequent efforts up Route 1D towards Mintal were repelled by fiercely defending Japanese forces. Due to the strong resistance, elements of the 34th Regiment attempted to drive north along the high ground on the eastern bank of the Talomo River to bypass the Japanese defenses on Route 1D. By May the 8th, the 21st Regiment finally crossed the east side of Mintal. However, in the face of Japanese artillery, motor and machine gun fire, they had to withdraw back to the west bank 2 days later. At the same time, the 19th Regiment was expanding its hold in the Davao area, striking into the high ground controlling the coast road immediately west of the Davao River on May the 10th. They also cleared scattered Japanese strongpoints on hills just north of Davao and on the Samal Island. 2 days later, the 21st Regiment again attacked northwards along the eastern bank of the Talomo, successfully clearing out numerous positions from which the Japanese had directed fire on Route 1D. By the 14th, the highway all the way north to Mintal was finally secured. In the meantime, the 124th Regiment started north from Kebawe on May the 6th. However, the recently arrived Japanese defenders at Maramag managed to delay the occupation of this town until May the 12th, thus accomplishing their task more inadequately. Despite this success, Eichelberger had shrewdly sensed that Morozumi would attempt to make one last stand in the hills northwest of Davao. Therefore, he decided to land the 108th Regiment behind the enemy lines in the Macalar Bay area to expedite the conquest of Mindanao and open up a new supply route to the 31st Division. Accordingly, on May the 10th, the 108th Regiment landed unopposed along the southeastern shore of Macalar Bay, making contact almost immediately with the guerrilla units operating in the region. This regiment then drove down the Sari Highway to meet the 31st Division advancing from the south, encountering no significant resistance until May the 13th, when they faced strong Japanese defenses near Dalirig. With its rear protected by the recently landed 3rd Battalion of the 164th Regiment, the 108th proceeded to attack the enemy positions with great intensity, finally forcing the Japanese to retreat to the area east of Malibali by May the 16th. Concurrently, on the 13th, the 155th Regiment passed through the 124th Regiment to continue their drive northwards, meeting little opposition but facing supply problems. By May the 20th, the Americans finally reached the outskirts of Malibali, where fire from remnants of the 30th Field Artillery Regiment halted their advance. Realizing that the regiment could not haul its weapons into the mountains east of Malibali, Morozumi left the unit at Malibali to fight a rearguard action, which was successful in keeping the 155th Infantry out of the town until at least May the 21st. On the 22nd and 23rd, the 155th continued up the Saudi Highway, encountering elements of Morozumi's northern sector unit that had not learnt that the American troops had reached Malibale, and they were still withdrawing southwards to join the 30th Division's main body. Pressed by troops of the 108th Infantry 40th Division, which had already landed at Makilahar Bay, the retreating forces gave the 155th Infantry little trouble, and about 2 p.m. on May the 23rd, the 155th made contact with the 108th near Impalutao, 12 miles northwest of Malibale. Its share in the task of clearing the Sarai Highway cost the 31st Division approximately 90 men dead and 250 wounded, while the 108th Infantry 40th Division lost about 50 men dead and 100 wounded. Together, the two units had killed almost 1,000 Japanese during their operations along the highway and captured nearly 25 more. Nevertheless, the 30th Division had managed to escape east, this time to establish new positions near Sele. Back in Davao on May the 15th, Woodruff directed the 21st and the 34th Regiments to attack abreast to the north and northwest, targeting the Japanese center. Meanwhile, the 19th Regiment advanced north to clear the northeastern shores of Davao Gulf, linking up with guerrilla forces north of the Gulf, and ultimately swinging westward against the 100th Division's left flank forces. Surprised by the lack of enemy attacks against his flanks, Harada concluded that the American forces intended to neglect his flanks in favor of a frontal assault on his center. As a result, he weakened the defenses of the left sector unit to reinforce the Mental line, leaving only Admiral Doy's air naval troops to defend his left flank. On the 17th, Woodruff renewed his offensive. The 19th Regiment struck north to establish contact with the guerrilla 107th Division, while the 34th Regiment began clearing the coastal hills between Telomo and the Davao rivers, attacking northwest towards Tugbak. The 21st Regiment also drove north towards Tugbak in the face of determined opposition. Progress in the following days was slow due to intense artillery, machine gun, rocket motor, and rifle fire. However, by the 27th, the 21st Regiment seized the Tugbak area, with the 34th Regiment arriving the next day to relieve them. As Harada's strongest defenses had been breached, he ordered a general withdrawal to the hastily established second line crossing Route 1D in the vicinity of Ula. Furthermore, the 19th Regiment managed to establish contact with the guerrillas by the 24th, as they secured Route 1 north of Davao. On the 29th, the 19th Regiment struck westward towards Doy's Mandong defenses, closing in 2 days later to engage the naval troops in some fierce combat. Concurrently, on the 30th, the 34th Regiment attacked towards Ula, which fell easily the following day, though progress then slowed in the face of fanatic resistance. Reinforced by the recently arrived 3rd Battalion of the 163rd Regiment on June the 4th, the 34th began to make some headway beyond Ula on the secondary road, gaining about a mile by June the 6th before swinging east towards Mandong. The next day, having overrun Doy's outer defenses, the 19th Regiment advanced steadily into the main positions near Mandong, which ultimately would fall by June the 9th, just as the 34th was reaching the area. Continuing further north, the 34th was almost 3 miles north of Ula along both roads and found few signs of organized Japanese resistance by the 11th. However, the 19th Regiment would not clear the hills north of Mandong until the 15th. In the meantime, the 21st Regiment struck north from Lamogan on May the 31st along secondary roads west of Route 1D, ultimately seizing Wangang on June the 16th and forcing Harada's battered forces to commence a full retreat northwards in complete disarray. After the fall of Kulanan 3 days later, Harada finally decided to retreat to a new line near the Banos River. Yet Woodruff's troops continued to pursue them, rapidly crossing the Tamogan River and inflicting heavy casualties on the retreating enemy until they reached the mountain barrio of Kibangay on June the 26th, where the pursuit was finally halted. Looking back to the north, with the Saturday Highway cleared, the 124th Regiment began probing into the mountains to the east in late May, encountering heavy resistance, rough terrain, bad weather, and supply problems. Nevertheless, by June the 5th, Morozumi abandoned his plan to hold the Salai area for a month and slowly began moving his best troops eastward towards Waloy in the Agusan River Valley, harassed by Filipino guerrillas along the entire way. In the end, Salai was finally occupied on June the 9th, with troops of the 108th Regiment pushing further to the Bobonoan River 4 days later. Additionally, the 155th Regiment arrived on the Pulagani River on June the 12th, with elements of the 162nd Regiment stuck 20 miles into the mountains east from Maramag by June the 26th. On the 25th, the 1st Battalion of the 155th Regiment successfully landed on Butuan Bay and managed to reach Waloy before the Japanese could on June the 27th, dispersing the 3rd Battalion of the 41st Regiment that was holding the area. However, the Japanese retreat was so slow that Morozumi was still assembling his forces about 7 miles up the Agusan from Waloy by the end of the war. Far to the northwest, units of the 31st Division had been probing southeast along the upper section of the Kabawe-Talamo Trail ever since early May, and on the 11th of that month, a battalion combat team of the 167th launched a reconnaissance in force directed by General Sibert. The Japanese along this section of the trail, about 1,000 men in all, comprised a conglomerate mass of service troops with just a few infantry. Control was vested in General Tomechika, chief of the staff of the 35th Army, who had set up a small headquarters groupment near Barrio Pinamola, some 20 miles southeast of Kibawe. The Japanese force had a defensive potential far greater than its strength and nature would indicate, for the terrain gave the Japanese every conceivable advantage. Bounded on both sides by dense jungle and a thick rainforest, the trail as far as Pinamola ran up and down steep ridges and was scarcely jeep wide. Rains of the late May soon rendered all sections of the trail completely impassable to wheeled vehicles, and supplies had to come in by airdrop, supplemented when possible by hand-carrying parties and laden carabaos. The mud was so deep that often troops had to pull, push, or even jack the carabaos out of the gooey holes. Delayed by the Japanese, the terrain, and the weather, the 167th Infantry Battalion did not reach the Pulagani River, 13 miles southwest of Kibawe, until May the 29th. Then, although the Japanese from the trail could no longer offer any threat to the 31st Division, the battalion continued south towards Pinamola, aided considerably by guerrillas. The remnants of the 1st Battalion 74th Infantry and the South Sector Unit 30th Division, which had been driven into the mountains along Highway 3 by the swift American advance in central Mindanao, had meanwhile been attached to Tomechika's forces early in June. Troops of the 167th Infantry finally reached Pinamola on June the 30th, as the remaining Japanese were withdrawing southwards another 8 miles to the crossing of the Kuleman River. Progress as far as Pinamola had cost the 167th approximately 60 men killed and 180 wounded, while the Japanese had lost almost 400 killed along the same section of trail. Elements of the 167th Infantry held along the northwestern section of the Kibawe-Talamo Trail until the end of the war, and as of August the 15th, the regiment was preparing to send troops across the Kuleman River to continue the advance southeast. On that date, nearly 30 miles of Japanese improved trail, only 19 air miles, still separated the 167th from the guerrilla units operating in the vicinity of Kibange. Organized remnants of Rada's 100th Division holed up until the end of the war in the rugged terrain north of the 30-mile stretch of the trail. And finally, the 24th Reconnaissance Troops successfully landed on the southeastern shore of Sarangani Bay on July the 4th to establish contact with the guerrilla 116th Regiment, subsequently clearing the bay's shores against negligible resistance. July the 12th, the 1st Battalion of the 21st Regiment landed on the northwestern shore, just as 2 provisional battalions were arriving in the area from different locations. The 3 forces began to clear the area, successfully locating and destroying the only Japanese unit in the region by July the 25th. This concluded the campaign in Mindanao, during which the Americans suffered 820 men killed, 2,880 wounded. In turn, almost 10,540 Japanese were killed in eastern Mindanao by June the 30th, with the pursuing Filipino-American units killing another 2,325 Japanese by the war's end. Roughly 600 Japanese prisoners were captured, over 250 of whom were civilians, before August. After the war, about 22,250 Japanese troops and 11,900 civilians turned themselves in. It is estimated that an additional 8,235 Japanese lost their lives due to starvation and disease between April and the war's end. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. In the spring of 1945, the fierce battle for Okinawa escalated as General Buckner's troops captured crucial strongholds, pushing the Japanese forces into a retreat. Meanwhile, the liberation of Mindanao was kicking up. American forces launched a rapid invasion confronting Japanese defenders who were heavily fortified in the mountainous regions. Despite stubborn resistance, American troops relentlessly battled, ultimately culminating in significant victories, paving the way for a liberation of the Philippines.